I'm Daniel Steinberg, and you're listening to The Maggid Method, a new podcast about drushos. Today we interview Rabbi comedian Bob Alper. Enjoy.
Yeah, you shaved, which is nice.
I didn't actually.
I didn't? Okay, well, I can't tell.
I shaved, when was it? At 5 o'clock in the morning, Tuesday morning in Orlando. And then I went to the march in Washington. And I looked at it. And then came home late that night. And then I overnighted in Albany. I got into Albany about 12:30 in the morning, so I stayed home.
Wow.
Came home yesterday, so I haven't shaved.
Okay, well, I couldn't tell. You look clean shaven to me, at least from my perspective. Yeah. We've never met, but doing a little research for the conversation this morning, I realized that we have a little bit in common. So I see you went to HUC. So I'm in Columbus. So right. You spent some time in Ohio.
Yeah.
And I grew up in Binghamton, Syracuse, and Rochester. And I see that you spent time in Buffalo.
Right.
So you're upstate New York kind of person for 5 or 6 years, I think it was.
Yes. Yep. And I'm still a Bills fan.
Yeah. And,
I actually, in Buffalo, our son was a toddler, and we were in a record store, and we let him go, and he almost, a man almost tripped over him, but the man was able to quickly sidestep him, and I looked.
Yeah.
It was O.J. Simpson.
Oh wow.
Yeah. He's good at dancing around little children.
Right. I remember that commercial with him running through the airport,
Yes.
the rented car. Yeah.
Forgot about that.
And then so you're a comedian and a rabbi, and as well right. I perform comedy and a rabbi as well. So we have this confluence of worlds. So I thought it'd be really nice to just talk a little bit.
I can tell you, I had the comedy bug since I was very young, and I use that in my act. I actually talk about when I started doing comedy as a very young. But I'll say that for you.
Who were some of your influences when you were growing up?
I grew up on. I wore out Bob Newhart and Shelley Berman records. I listened to them over. I memorized them. I adapted them. And then during my teenage years, I was in a Reformed Jewish Youth Group in Providence. I was the president of our group in my senior year. I was an officer in the region, New England region. And when we had conclaves, these 5 or 7 day get-togethers at Jewish camps or conference centers, or whatever, they'd had talent night. And I would memorize a Bob Newhart or Shelley Berman routine and perform it. And I just lived for those moments. And sometimes I adapted them. I mean, Shelley Berman had a routine about calling calling somebody's house. And hello, sweetie, is your mommy home? And then the kid doesn't let him off. So I adapted it. Kennedy was in the White House, and I adapted it as somebody calling the White House. Hello, sweetheart, is your daddy home? And Caroline says, and it really worked. And then we did improv stuff, and I remember Rabbi Alexander Schindler. He was the president of the Reform movement. He was an amazing man, beloved man with a great sense of humor. He was, at that time, the regional director of the Reform movement in New England. So he was at our camp, and his wife, Rhea, would be with him, and his then 2 daughters. We had a skit in which I played Alex Schindler, and one of the girls played his wife, Rhea. And I remember saying to her, the food situation is dire, Rhea.
Oh, that's great.
So it killed. But that was, but even further back, and I say this in my routine, that I was always funny. When I was a little kid, the word we used to use for our rear end was not fanny or tuchus. We called it a tutu, which might have been just our family word. But I can recall, as a little kid, a babysitter came. She said, does anyone want to go to the park? One kid said, I want to go. My sister said, I want to go too. And I can remember saying, I want to go too. And I looked at God and said, you may not think that's so hysterical. But I remember thinking at that very moment, I am one funny toddler.
That's amazing. So how come it took you till 1986 to try out to do stand up?
Because I never ever considered doing stand up comedy, even as a hobby. I never thought of it, but
Hmm.
I always did funny. And I can tell you later on how I use humor all the time in my sermons, my teaching, my administration,
Yeah.
everything. Always humor, um, judicious humor. Even in funerals, and I can talk about that judiciously. Not a. I didn't do a stand-up routine over the grave, but humor is when it's appropriate. It really is very, very effective. I'm sure you know that.
Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
but it's so I always did funny, but then my career followed a pattern. I was the assistant, then associate rabbi in a 1,600 family congregation in Buffalo, starting out, and then I became the only rabbi in a 450 family congregation in Philadelphia. And in the meantime, I earned a doctorate from Princeton Theological Seminary. We had built a vacation home in Vermont, which we loved going to. And
Hmm.
I was doing tremendous number of weddings and funerals for non-affiliated people on my own time.
Yeah.
And I was in the middle of a 5-year contract, but I called the director of placement. I said, I'm thinking of leaving. And he said, well, by the rules, you have to serve half of your contract. I did everything according to the book. And I
Hmm.
announced I was going to be leaving, and I left the congregation after 8 years. And I did that. One reason is because I had a very supportive wife.
Yeah.
That's the most important thing. And I figured I could do counseling. I could do pastoral counseling. I opened an office with a psychiatrist. We shared space. We called it Jews and Screws, but that wasn't a good idea. Uh, but we shared an office. We opened this, and that was the plan. And then a month after I left the congregation, I was up in Vermont, here in Vermont, where we live now full time. And I was reading the Jewish Exponent, the weekly Philadelphia paper. It had a little ad, about this big. Do you think you're
Yeah.
funny? If so, send us in 50 words or less why you're funny for the Jewish Comic of the Year contest. So I did. I wrote something about my sermons make them roll in the aisles, but I'm really a rabbi. And by the way, I'm answering this in less than 50 words, even though I'm a
Hmm.
rabbi. Something like that. And I
Yeah.
knew I had an advantage being a rabbi. So Mike Elkin, the entertainment editor, he called me one afternoon. And I remember just where I was standing. He said, okay, you're one of 50 finalists. Tell me a joke. Boom. And I told him a joke. So I was one of
Yeah.
13 finalists. And the deal was we had to do 5 minutes on stage at a comedy club in downtown Philadelphia in front of a select audience. It was a full house and they all came to see their own hero. Um, and so my very first time, and it was the hardest 5 minutes I've ever done. Where am I going to find 5 whole minutes of comedy? So I
Yeah.
walked out. They knew I'm a rabbi. I was the only rabbi there. I walked out on the stage wearing a pulpit robe. I didn't wear a tallit, but I wore a pulpit robe.
Yeah.
And everyone laughed. And then I spread my arms as wide as I could, looked at the audience, and I said, try not to think of me as a rabbi. So, boom.
Yeah.
Then the
Yeah.
second thing I said was, I know this is a contest, and I have an unfair advantage, which I want to address because it's really not right for the other people. I know you're looking at me and you're thinking of another very well-known comedian, and I don't want you to make that association because it wouldn't be fair to the other contestants. And I thank you. And as I'm doing this, I'm taking off my robe, and I turned around to put the robe on the chair behind me, and taped to my back is a huge headshot of Steve Martin.
Uh-huh.
So,
Right. Right.
so
I can see the resemblance. Yeah.
exactly. I've
Yeah.
always used that. So
Yeah.
the end result is when I do. 2 nights ago I was doing stand up in where was it? Ocala,
Florida.
Florida. So, and the person who introduced me used my standard introduction, which goes like this:
Mhm.
in 1968, a Philadelphia Jewish newspaper held a Jewish Comic of the Year contest. The winner was a chiropractor. In second place, a lawyer. Please welcome the third place winner, Rabbi Bob Alper. And that's how I start my show.
Right. Right. That's amazing. That's
So,
awesome.
and I came in third, and among the celebrity judges was Liz Starr, who was the host of AM Philadelphia, which is was the biggest local TV program in Philadelphia at that time. And she thought I
Hmm.
should have won. She was right. So she invited me to be on her show as a guest. She had a crew film me performing at a comedy club, and that was a segment, and that launched a career. Yeah, that's where it all started.
Never looked back.
No.
Yeah. So let's go back to the sermons, because you said you had them rolling in the aisles when you were the rabbi, but so tell me about your style a little bit, about the style of sermons, because there's the inspirational educational component, and then there's also the engagement component. So how did you approach it? What was your approach?
Um,
And how did it evolve over the years?
it remained pretty. I always use. Here's the line of my routine. My life is my routine. I say I always use jokes and funny stories in my sermons in front of my congregations, which has given me now over 50 years experience performing in front of a hostile audience. But that's not true. I started out using humor back in seminary. It's a 5-year program, which, as I say in my act, a 5-year program. I was able to squeeze the 5-year program into 6 because Israel is not part of the curriculum. Back in the 60s, I took a year off and went to Israel. But anyway, so during the 4th of the 5 years, every student has to deliver a sermon in the chapel in front of classmates, other students, and faculty. And trust me, it's really scary. They call it sermon evaluation, although we refer to it as sermon emasculation. You give the sermon, then they discuss it right there. So it was scary, and each of us at the beginning of the year was assigned a cedra. What did I get? Tazria Mitzora. So listeners might wonder, why 2? Isn't just one like, Vayera or something? No, Tazria Mitzora. They put 2 cedras together because there's nothing in them to preach about except leprosy. I mean, they're awful. And I found out a few years ago, they didn't assign those randomly. They picked who gets what cedra. So the faculty decided Alper should get Tazria Mitzora. Okay, thank you very much, guys.
Yeah.
So
what went into that decision?
Was that?
I said, yeah, you have to wonder what went into that decision to give that to you. Yeah, how that shook out.
So here I got to preach about leprosy. And so what happened was, at the appropriate moment at 10:25 on a Tuesday afternoon, I walked out of the bima of the Hebrew Union College chapel. I stood there. They had a kind of a brown felt cover, and on the sides it's dark brown, made so by the sweat of the hands of student rabbis holding on for dear life as they preached to the faculty and their classmates. So I imitated them. I stood there and I gripped it, and I looked at and I said, it had worked. Naaman was no longer a leper. The waters of the river Jordan had cured his leprosy. And I'm going on like this for about maybe 45 seconds until out of the loudspeaker in the ceiling comes a woman's voice saying, "That's boring."
Ooh, you got a heckle.
What? She said, "I said you're boring." And I looked around. I said, "Who are you?" She says, "God." I said, well, who am I? Bill Cosby doing a Noel routine? And so what's what? You're boring. The gist of the sermon was God was annoyed that student rabbis never preached about any theology. They ignore her. They talk about current events, talking about the Torah portion, but not, and they're boring. And then at one point she says, "Where do you give your sermons?" I said, "Well, in my student congregation. I go every other weekend to Williamson, West Virginia." She says, Williamson. Oh, yes. I think my Shekhinah was there in 1961. So for listeners, Shekhinah means God's presence. They say when people study together, there the Shekhinah resides. So I think my Shekhinah was there in 1960. So, and I said, "How come you're a woman?" He said, "You've never heard of the Bat Kol?" It means the daughter of the voice, which is another name for God. So got some good laughs. And then, eventually we got to the point where I'm okay, you're right. We don't preach about, we're all preaching current events. We need to do, I'm going to do that. I'm going to preach more about theology. At which point you hear her sing, hallelujah, hallelujah. I actually, anyway, and then at the very end, I said, yes, that's what I'm going to do. I think that'll be great. Won't it? And I looked up, nothing. Won't it be good? Hello? Hello? Anybody there? Gone. That was the end of the sermon. So two things.
That's great. Wait, so who was the lady?
An actress I had hired.
Yeah.
It was all completely scripted. So first of all, the response was the only response. Mark Gelman, who was a classmate of mine, he said, okay, where is she? I said, who? I didn't bring her out. The second thing that happened was at the end of the year, they announced the Cora Khan Prize for Sermon Delivery and Oratory. I won. They won.
Yeah.
Third thing that happened, we had a wonderful speech professor named Lowell McCoy. He was a minister, and he was probably the most popular of all our faculty members. For years, he used the manuscript of my sermon to teach sermon writing and delivery.
Oh, what an honor.
Yeah. So it said to me, humor works. And after that, and even before that, I always use humor, but I use it all the time.
Yeah. When you were giving sermons and you were injecting humor into them, were there any detractors that people would say that there's not enough substance in your sermon, that you're just trying to get laughs and entertain, and you're kind of a ham, or was it appreciated by and large?
I never received negativity, except for one of my, this wasn't about sermons, but I'll never forget when I entered the Jewish Comic of the Year contest, one of my classmates who was living in Philadelphia, he said that, he was pretty full of himself. He said, all of your colleagues are universally embarrassed by what you did. Yeah, okay. So fast forward maybe, 10 years later, I'm out west. There's a conference. I'm performing at a conference, and he's there. And he comes up to me and very friendly says, Bob, I'm really tired. I came from the East Coast. I'm on East Coast time. So if you see me walking out, it's because I'm just really exhausted. It's not, don't take it personally. It was nice of him to say that. And I watched, he got up mid-show and he walked to the back door and he stayed there. He couldn't leave. So but this is the guy who's hypercritical. But
right, massive. What do they say? Revenge is the best revenge is massive success. Yeah,
exactly. So but I always use humor, but again judiciously. Even I'll come back around to this at some point, but and give you more of the details about it. But one of the last times I used humor, does the name Gerda Klein mean anything to you? Have you heard of Gerda Klein? Holocaust survivor.
Okay.
Gerda was a Holocaust survivor. She wrote one of the very first autobiographies, memoirs, in 1957, called All But My Life. It's now in its 75th, 80th printing. And Gerda was a speaker all over the world. She received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Obama. Mm-hmm. She and her husband started in organizations, but she was absolutely beloved. And her story was, she was one of 200 women who survived a death march of 4,000. And I can tell you more about her. In any event, when I delivered her eulogy, I used a couple funny stories in it.
Yeah.
But her eulogy was a very serious eulogy, but I used humor, which would have pleased her to know. Well, it did please her because she was aware of my eulogy before she died. Anyway, so always, but in my sermons, the same thing. I would. It's an attention getting device. It brings people in. It warms the congregation. When
Yeah.
people laugh, they relax. It's Talmudic. Rabba in the Talmud
Yeah.
always started his lessons with a joke. I always tell people that when I'm lecturing on humor. Always start his lectures with a joke, and then people would relax, and then they could get serious once they were relaxed. It's a
Yeah.
terribly effective technique, and it's ancient, and it's Jewish. And so I went into my files. I'll give you an example of how I use
Yes,
humor in
please.
the sermon. This is Rosh Hashanah morning 2014. After I left the congregation, the 450 family congregation, I decided, I got to do something for the high holidays. I don't want to listen to some other rabbi. My God, that would be terrible. Um,
Yeah.
so I sent out invitations to people who were unaffiliated, like whose family members' funerals I'd officiated, or weddings and I had no idea what I'd draw, but I ended up with about over 100 people and did high holy services. Very soon there, the next 1 or 2 years, we ended up with about 450 people every year and had high holiday services and for about 33 years. And I just
Wow.
love doing it. I call it B'nai Bob
Hmm.
because, no officers, it was me. I did
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah. Your show.
It was my show. I hired Philadelphia orchestra musicians. We had an organist who's the world-class organist, a choir, cantorial solos. The music was splendid. And it passed the
Wow.
Sherry Alper test, my wife. And I
Hmm.
could do whatever I want. And they really worked. I mean, people are still mourning the end of these services,
Yeah.
which,
It's nice to be able to do that on your own terms. Not as an employee and not having to deal with a lot of the mishigas that comes along with being a rabbi of the big shul. You can do the pastoral work, you do the life cycle events, and then and you just you can drop in twice a year for
right?
for the big days. Yeah, that's nice.
Exactly. It was,
Yeah.
and then within 4 years, we moved to Vermont. I used to do Shabbat dinners every month or so, and once we moved to Vermont, we just did high holiday services, and I didn't do life cycle events except for 1 or 2 people and it worked
Hmm.
out very well. But here's an example of how I preach.
Yeah,
I'll
let's
just
hear it.
read a couple paragraphs. This is Rosh Hashanah morning. My wife Sherry and our son Zach went to Peru a couple of weeks ago. I stayed home to write sermons and prepare for the high holy days. You're welcome. And then,
Pregnant pause. Yeah.
and then it goes into the gist of the sermon. I wrote, we have time. Can I read this a couple
Yeah.
paragraphs?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. This is it.
To be honest, I was a bit nervous about their traveling to a strange place, particularly without me, the family travel agent, tour guide, and overall control freak. During the days before they left, I must have asked Sherry 4 times if she'd packed her passport. She had. What was comforting to me was the knowledge that my aunt had taken a similar trip a few years ago at age 80 and returned safe and happy. Still, I worried. Not surprisingly, what often ran through my mind during the days of preparation and while they were traveling were the words Sherry and I spoke during the naming ceremonies for both of our children way back in 1972 and 1975. Acknowledging our offspring's eventual autonomy, we recited to their infant ears and to our own hearts, "It is the way of parents to care for their children, yet we would not protect you overmuch or overlong, so that our love becomes a prison from which you must escape." Wise words to consider at the start of a son or daughter's life. Wise words that often come back to me, particularly in worrisome times, such as when a child or a wife or anyone I love heads out into the unknown, into a place where I cannot protect them overmuch or overlong. And so they went to Peru and had a wonderful time, even though Sherry lost, then eventually found her passport at the Lima airport. So what I've done there is started with humor,
Yeah.
reference a creative life cycle event that we use for our kids, reference how a Jewish ceremony with our kids is still incredibly meaningful 47 and 51 years later. In fact,
Yeah.
our daughter is going again She's going to Egypt again. She's a scuba diver. She's a rescue diver, and we're worried. She's going to Egypt. She's done it before, but we cannot protect you over much or over long, so that our love becomes a prison of which you must escape. The words,
Wow.
and what I feel is, if Judaism, and the sermon goes on about that, if Judaism would, or Jewish leaders would provide our members with terribly meaningful events that resonate in our being, then Judaism becomes much more important. It becomes, a help, a guide. And I attended a Zoom bris a few months ago, and it was terrible. It was nervous joking. It was people reading very theistic, meaningless to me, meaningless stuff. It said nothing about the reality of having a child and raising a child, and the feelings and the emotions and the preparation, and it provided no guidance. Nothing. This ceremony did. So that's in my preaching and my teaching. I try and make Jewish religious experiences meaningful, and not just got to get through this like a sermon. Got to get through this to get to the oneg.
Yes, I was going to ask you how you balance the Rabbi would open up the class with a joke, and then everyone would then you'd go into the substance. And sometimes you tend to lose people that way because they perk up for the funny parts, they perk up for the stories, they perk up for the drama, and then as soon as you transition into something substantial, they kind of check out until you revive them with another joke. But it sounds like your access point is the meaning that you inject the meaning, and that is also interesting. It's not just a dry class; it's something relevant, something meaningful.
Yeah, I mean, I get these sermons that my colleagues send all the time. I can't relate. I mean, one guy will start out a sermon in the book of, in Numbers chapter 17, verse 4. The letter Aleph appears every 7 words. Why does that? What does this say to us? Well, it says nothing to us. I couldn't care less. But that's what they do. They talk about not even a biblical story. There's something in the Torah, and they do the stuff that maybe people who are really into this in a classroom in a seminary would go through. But the toy store owner who's sitting in the 4th row couldn't care less, but he probably would care if somebody tells him or helps teach him about how to deal with your anxiety over raising a child, and what Judaism teaches us about that, and touch his life. I'm just amazed at sermons that come across my transom that are so boring. And if you start out with humor and then get really boring, you deserve to be turned off. Let me give you another example. Sherry and I did a scholar in residence program in a Florida synagogue. And I did a lecture on Friday night at the oneg, and then stand up Saturday night. So Sherry and she came down with me. She doesn't usually, but she came down with me. And we were sitting at services, and there's about 60 people there. And the rabbi was a young rabbi who played a guitar, was a Jewish hootenanny. And he gives a sermon. And we heard before that he was on his way out. And my assumption by his sermon was maybe some spies from another congregation were there to watch him. That he knew. Anyway, he goes on and on about Shabbat, the day of rest. All the anxieties are gone. All the hard work is behind us. And a typical rip and read Shabbat is great sermon. But I'm thinking, who's he talking to? What have these people done all week? They played canasta, maybe pickleball. They've watched movies. They've volunteered for organizations. They haven't worked in 20 years. The stress and strain of being in corporate life or running an organization or a store, that's behind them. So
Didn't know
it's
his audience.
not meaningful. If he were to talk about maybe about the anxiety of aging, well, yeah, they might listen.
Sure.
Or about what happens, how can you best help your friends who find are coping with illness? What can you do? How can you? Yeah, and Judas has a lot to teach us about that. But and maybe in other sermons he does it. But this is typical, and this is why people fall asleep.
Why do you think that is? Why don't people, are they just not in tune? Are they they don't feel capable of doing it? Do they? What's your take on why people aren't more, um, I guess, zeroed in on the transformational, meaningful components of the speech, the sermon, versus just kind of talking at people, giving the canned, Jewish messages that they've been taught to distribute.
I think people are normal. They want to hear something that touches their lives. And frankly, a seminary classroom discussion of Hebrew letters in an acrostic or something. No, okay. Tell me that for 4 minutes. It's interesting, but it doesn't touch their lives. And I think the rabbis who've been trained with that, um, that's what they have in their. That's the only thing they have in their arsenal. So they got to use
Mm.
it, but it's not working. I mean, the best example, and I use this all the time, is a story by a man named Harry Golden, who was a newspaper writer and humorist in the 50s and 60s. My father loved reading. He wrote, his paper was called the Carolina Israelite. And Harry Golden tells a story about how his father, who was an atheist all his life, when he became elderly, went to synagogue every day. He said, "Dad, why, you're an atheist. Why do you go to synagogue every day?" He said, "Well, it's like this. There are all kinds of reasons to go to synagogue. Garfinkel goes to talk to God. I go to talk to Garfinkel." And, you know, and I think of my closest friend in our town in Vermont, um,
Yeah,
who is dedicated. He's dedicated. He's been the president of the synagogue. He's always an officer. He's always there. And for the high holy days, particularly, and other days, he ushers. He loves to usher because he gets to schmooze.
Mhm.
He doesn't have to
Yeah,
read stuff that is meaningless to him. Hate to say it, but meaningless to him. He doesn't have to
yeah,
listen to lectures or sermons or whatever that don't touch him in any way or in small way. But he gets to schmooze, and that's enough. And
yeah.
that's what he does. Yeah.
So do you see any changes happening in terms of the younger generation, the way they're being trained to be more transformative, to be more relevant, to be more engaging? Do you see any of that happening?
I'm not out there enough to know. I watch. I do know that synagogues are having a very hard time competing with Central Synagogue and Park Avenue Synagogue, whose rabbis are marvelous preachers and who touch your heart and your soul in every sermon they give.
Yeah,
And that's but I don't think the average pulpit rabbi is able to compete with them. I think they would be smart to follow their example, and not hold a class on on Hebrew grammar as part of their sermon.
yeah,
Um, but it's hard. It's hard being in congregational life when people could, when you're trying with a limited budget and to do a service where people can sit at home and watch Central Synagogue or Wise Temple in California. There's all
yeah,
kinds.
yeah, yeah. What advice would you have for someone giving a sermon who's not a comedian, who's not a natural born entertainer? What would you say that he should focus on or she should focus on?
Well, I think the subject matter should be relevant, should touch people's lives. Uh, the the narrative should, if possible, should be personal. People love to hear stories about you or about people you know. People love to hear stories. Period. Period. They love stories. So any kind of stories, um, and remember, it's not a lecture in a seminary classroom. They want to hear stories. They want to be able to you know, when they the next day when they're with their friends and they say, what did the rabbi preach about? They want to be able to tell them what they preach. If the rabbi preached about how there's an acrostic in a certain psalm, and they're going to say, I don't quite remember. And by the way, even my own preaching, I'll say to my wife, okay, it's time to start. It's June. It's time to start thinking about the high holiday sermon. What did I speak about last year? I don't remember. Neither do I remember. Yeah. How can they remember? But I mean, you're not going to give the same sermon over and over again. But people hear, they want to be touched. They don't want to endure a sermon, and humor or lightness are will touch people. One of my favorite authors, and I quote her all the time, is Maya Angelou. And she has a great line. She
I know what you're going to say.
Yeah, okay. People will forget what you say. They'll forget what you do. They never forget how you make them feel. I usually end my shows with that. I did a show recently in Florida. 650 people. It was great. I loved it. And I ended not with a rousing joke, not with an hysterical, which is what a comedian should do. I said, I quoted Maya Angelou, and I said, these are really hard times. Tonight, for an hour and a half, I hope I made you feel good.
Mm-hmm.
And they loved it.
That's great. Yeah, sure.
And that's what I do. That's what I love doing comedy.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question about notes, because I saw you had your notes from your sermon back in 2014. Do you read off your notes did you used to read off your notes when you're giving sermons, or was it kind of a mix, look down, look up?
When I write my sermons, every sermon I give, I write out in its entirety, from start to finish. And my wife is at our wedding, my uncle was a rabbi. He said to Sherry, and you should be a gentle critic. And she is. She's a terrific, she's a wonderful poet. She's a wonderful, and I will give my sermons to her. And sometimes, I'll finish a sermon and she'll say, when did you last preach about Soviet Jewry or something like that? Which means this one is not good. And, rip it up and start over again, because I value her opinions enormously. So, and by the way, with comedy, I have a line where I say, she's a psychotherapist. I say, we have a good arrangement. I don't criticize the way she does therapy, and she criticizes the way I do comedy. So, but in truth, I would write out the sermon totally and give them to her, and then she would go through them and make very important, good edits, not just the wording, but also even a lot of the thinking that goes into it. Say, maybe you should leave this out. This might offend somebody. This might bring up feelings that would be, whatever. She's excellent because she's a psychotherapist and a writer. And then, so all the sermons, I write at them, and then as far as delivering, I practice. So I deliver them. Hopefully, I saw a colleague deliver a sermon, and he just read it. It was lousy. So I'll give a sermon. I can look down, and then I look at the congregation, and and so they know I've got a script, but I maintain
your presence.
Yeah, absolutely. That's terribly important. So that's why I rehearse the sermons. So what happened was, I've written a couple books now. The first one is called Life Doesn't Get Any Better Than This: The Holiness of Little Daily Dramas. And the second book is called Thanks, I Needed That, and Other Stories of the Spirit. The first book I wanted to do a book about humor, a book of humor. And so I wrote a couple chapters, few chapters, and as I tell my audiences as far as writing books, as a comedian, people laughed at me, they applauded, and I looked at my life. What was missing? Rejection. So I decided to write a book, and sure enough, I got rejection. I sent off
Yeah.
chapters to agents. I got rejection after rejection, and then I got an agent, a New York literary agent. She thought it was good. And then she sent it off to publishers. Got rejection after rejection. And one rejection was the best because he said, humor is a really hard sell. And then my agent said, in this chapter, you wrote this paragraph, and it was poignant. There's something that, can you write poignant? I said, yeah, I can write poignant. So I wrote poignant. And I basically took sermons of mine and adapted it. Didn't take a lot of adaptation, but I adapted it to chapters. And she then marketed the book. And the publisher who selected my manuscript was Liguori Publications, which is the largest Catholic publisher in the country. The editor who selected, I don't know if you ever heard of Bishop Fulton Sheen from Rochester.
Yes.
Okay.
I have.
He was a popular, for your listeners, he was a priest, very popular, had a TV show, and people of all faiths loved him. Bishop Sheen. My parents used to watch him. He wasn't Father Coughlin. He was very popular and beloved. And the woman who worked for Liguori, who selected my manuscript, was his editor for 10 or 15 years and felt that my material was similar to his in terms of being from a person of one faith crossover material. Liguori selected the book. I wrote the book, put it together, 35 chapters, about sermon length for each chapter, maybe 2,000, 2,500 words. They published the book, and it ultimately went through 5 printings, 25,000 copies. And then later on, I wrote a second book with a different publisher, and that second publisher republished my first book. And I get wonderful feedback, and they're almost all the stories began as sermons, but they're not preachy. They're not they're not what you think. And if you didn't know, they started. And the first chapter of the second book, for example, is all about. It starts out in a kind of a light way. It talks about my wife was leaving her. She worked at Bennington College at the time, and she was leaving on a Thursday. Said goodbye to one of her friends, Irene. And she said, I'm going to be away. I'm going to a conference. And Irene, who was a 30-something Jewish woman, never married, in a going nowhere relationship with some guy, said, oh, Sherry, find me a husband. Sherry said, Irene, it's a rabbi's conference. She said, no, that'd be all right. So Sherry's conducting a workshop. And one guy stood out, tall guy with a beard, gentle, sweet, bright. Sherry sent him a note. She said, I've never done this, but I have a friend, Irene, and she's a lovely woman. And, I thought maybe, I've never done it. Maybe he wrote back, well, he said, have her call me. So she went home, told Irene about this guy, Howard. She called his synagogue. Secretary picked up. She hung up in nervous. And she called back. And then they talked. And long story made long. 6 months later, we attended their wedding. And then a couple of years later, their dream was realized. They had twins. But here's the thing. And here's where the story is going. The story is when the twins were born, we drove from Vermont down to New Jersey, where Howard had a pulpit, for the baby naming and the bris. And the night before, we were in her in the house, and there are a lot of people and drinking and eating and schmoozing. And I was talking to Irene, and Irene, the wife, told me that as far as the names, they knew the son would be named in memory of Howard's father, Nathaniel, Nate. And the daughter, she said she was going to use a couple names of women who were important in her life. And then late into her pregnancy, she had another thought. She said her parents were both survivors. Her father was the only survivor, and among those killed were his 4 teenage sisters. And
Mm-hmm.
she decided to name the daughter after 2 of her aunts. And when she told her father, her mother said that in 50 years or 40 or whatever, he had never, ever even mentioned their names. Never, it was too painful. Never talked to them. But knowing his granddaughter would be named after his sisters opened the floodgates. And as many survivors do late in their life, he began to talk and maybe to heal a little bit. And then the story ends with me sitting in the living room and the conversation going elsewhere. I was sitting in an easy chair. I was tired. I was driven down from Vermont. And so I was not talking to anyone. And I looked into the dining room. In the dim light, there was the crib with the 2 babies. And sitting by the crib was Irene's father. And he looked down, with his chin on his hand on the cribs. And the story ends, and with the weight of a feather, he caressed their heads.
Mm-hmm.
End of the story. So here's the story. Starts with a really funny thing. Find me a rabbi. Find me a husband. It's rabbis. That'll be all right. To the end of a man who is emotionally redeemed in some ways by the birth of these children. And so that's those are my stories.
Interesting. So tell me, you've straddled both sides of the fence in terms of giving sermons and stand-up comedy acts. In terms of the structure, tell me a little bit about the parallels or where they veer off from each other.
I mean, my sermons, I outline before I write them, and the structure is basically a grabber. I need to get their attention right away, and then there's weaving in illustration stories, facts, figures, whatever. If it's a story about Israel, Soviet Jewry, I'm going to talk how many thousands of people came in on Aliyah, whatever it is, and then a conclusion, and something that will leave people thinking, feeling, remembering, summarizing. So there's a structure that goes through them, but also, like any good storyteller, I want to keep their attention, keep it interesting, and not let people nod off. I want them to hear the next thing. Another one of my stories. I mean, my stories some are light. Most of them are quite serious, or they start out light and they become serious. One of my favorite stories, one of the favorite introductions is, it starts out, my father used to take showers with the lady next door. Well, I think people are going to read the second sentence when they hear that.
Yeah.
And they do.
Yeah.
And the story, it's a story that goes on. Well, it's a story about how we lived in a duplex house with a Christian family on the other side, a kid my age. And it used to be Hanukkah at my house, Christmas at his. We'd go back and forth, and he'd be envious of my Hanukkah presents, and I'd be envious of his Christmas presents and all that. And then I won't tell you the whole story, but it goes on to Hanukkah. It was different every year. Sometimes, I got really great presents, a bicycle or whatever. And then one year, my father was unemployed. We had no money. My parents said they couldn't give me anything. They couldn't afford anything. And then the last night of Hanukkah, they gave me a surprise gift, a little model boat, probably cost $1.95. They said, "You've been so understanding," and I, at the end of the story, I talk about all the days of my childhood, all the Hanukkahs of my childhood. I've got many presents. All I remember are 2. One was a bicycle with a generator by its side and a bell, and the other was a plastic model boat.
Mm-hmm.
So again, starts out with my father used to take showers with the lady next door. It ends with a rather serious, emotional story of how meaningful a gift that my parents really struggled to give me meant
Hmm.
back then, still does.
So you open with humor and kind of transition into meaning, poignancy,
Yeah,
and end on that tone. Um,
yeah. I hope with humor or something else is going to
Grab them.
grab it. I mean, there's one story about I officiated a funeral and nobody came. That's a story that resonates. Of all the stories I've written, that's the one that people comment about most. The story is called "A Woman Named Elizabeth Bat," and it's a story about. But I begin by talking about I officiated a funeral and nobody attended, and I tell that whole story. So it
Yeah.
does with humor, but it starts with a bring people in. Um, you know, don't change the channel.
Right. How do you deal with, I'm sure, it's inevitable sometimes people nod off during a sermon or, just they don't have that either attention span or they're just tired or whatever it is. And uh, how does that make you feel as a comic, knowing that, you could get them as
Yeah.
if you were entertaining them?
You know, I got to be really honest with you. I've never seen someone nod off. I look
Wow.
out, I can see face, I got good vision. I never see someone nod off. I um, what can I say?
That's amazing. Yeah.
It doesn't happen. I think because they want to hear what comes next. People are invested. I'm sure people have nodded off. Maybe I've missed them, but I can see all the way to the very back, and um, it doesn't happen. Nor do they talk. There's dead silence. When I give a sermon, there's absolute dead silence. Never, never. And, the occasional person who walks out to go to the bathroom, that happens, that's a biological
Hmm.
thing, but very
Yeah.
rare. There's not a group standing in the back schmoozing. No,
Yeah.
it's,
Yeah.
and that's why I miss doing it. I really love doing it. But, my books, which are available on Amazon and or my
Yeah.
website,
Plug away.
alper.com. Just BOBALPER.com. It's my website, and you can see all the books. I also have another book, a cartoon book called A Rabbi Confesses, subtitled Gentiles, see page 4. Um, that's the cartoons. It's a very funny book. That's available on my website as well. But
Yeah.
anyway, the Amazon and Barnes and Noble have the books.
Okay. What advice would you give for some emerging clergy that is embarking on their career of preaching? What if you had one or two nuggets of advice to give them? What would you tell
Um, well, it's a classic one. Is don't take yourself too seriously. Take your work as a rabbi seriously. Don't take yourself seriously, and lighten up, um, and be creative. Um, Understand that you know you that you need to engage people, and think about, does your subject engage somebody? Does it engage? Is what you're going to talk about engage a person who's a woman who's trying to balance a career as an owner of a business with raising children, with all the horror that's going on in the world today? Does it engage them, or is it meaningless stuff to them, meaningless stuff that you're really interested in because you're a rabbi and you've studied Torah, and that really, it turns you on. But does it turn her on? Does it touch her life? Does it make her life any better or easier or clearer? Or is she there because she feels a guilt and an obligation to be in synagogue, and that your sermon is something that she has to endure rather than um, benefit
them?
from? So that's my
Yeah.
humble advice.
Yeah. Yeah. That's amazing. And in terms of managing shrinking attention spans, how do you? What's your thoughts on that?
Managing what the attention?
Shrinking attention spans. People have shortened attention spans these
Yeah.
days. How do you? What's your
Um,
thoughts on that?
well, my first of all, the length of the sermon. I usually go 16 to 18 minutes. And in my comedy routine, I say my sermons usually last 16 to 18 minutes. If I have a sermon that's particularly detailed, I think I can go on a little bit longer. I don't mind seeing someone going like this. And for those who are just listening, I'm tapping my watch. I don't mind what bothers me. No, I don't mind if they look at their watch. If they tap their watch or shake their hand, then I'm in trouble. That's the joke. But the fact is, 16 to 18 minutes. And I don't blame people's short attention span on short attention span. I blame it on not being engaged. You can have a terrific ability to attention span, but if you're listening to something that is not touching your heart and your soul, it's you have to endure it. You're counting the minutes till the oneg when you can talk to
Yeah.
Garfield. Or
Right.
Look, when I go to services, the announcements. I love the announcements because people, that's talking to me, saying what's going on, and usually the person giving the announcements is smiling, and it's not just the announcements. They're saying we are a community, and you're part of this community, and I love that. So the announcements are a really important part of the service. I don't want to go into the whole thing about the liturgy, the prayers. That's another story. But anyway, I think that the sermons, if it's engaging, you don't have to worry about attention span. Look, people can watch. I mean, I watched a 3-hour movie the other day. I have as short or long attention span as anyone else. But if it's engaging, you can watch it. You can watch a half-hour sitcom. People, if rabbis say people are snoozing or going off because of short attention span. No, it's because what they're offering is not engaging. It's their fault. It's not the listeners.
Don't blame the audience.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's like well, when you're a performer, I say if the performer if the performer doesn't if there's a small crowd that shows up, they say, he wasn't a draw or she wasn't a draw. But if a large crowd shows up, they say the committee did a wonderful job. So it's lose-lose for a performer. But
right.
same thing, I think it's the material, and it's not just that particular sermon. It's if people are used to the fact that they will be engaged, they'll listen, even if it's a B or C level sermon, even if it's not your best, and we all go down the toilet once in a while. If they're acclimated to saying what this person says is generally engaging, I'm going to listen, because even if there's 4 or 5 minutes where I'm not, something is going to come up that I'll be engaged. There's a colleague named Jeff Salkins, Rabbi Jeff Salkin. He's a friend of mine. He's the kind of guy, when I see any article he's written, I will read it, because anything he writes is engaging,
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's the same obtains for any kind of speaker.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Bob. I really appreciate it. And I want to maybe plug your book and some of your performances where you're going to be, and so people who are interested can follow you.
Sure. Well, my book, again, the name of the book is Life Doesn't Get Any Better Than This: The Holiness of Little Daily Dramas. And by the way, it's interesting how that book came about. I was doing a show in Detroit, and I called the religion writer of the Detroit Free Press, as I often did back in the 90s when they had religion writers. He was canned, as all religion writers were fired these days. They don't exist anymore. But he was the religion editor of the Detroit Free Press. I called him. I said, And I usually did very well doing this. I'd say, my name is Bob Alper. I'm a rabbi and a stand-up comic. I'll be performing at Temple Israel. And his response was, do you have a book? I said, no. He said, well, call me when you have a book. Okay. Well, scratch that one.
Yeah.
A few years later, I came back to someplace in Detroit. I called him, hi, I'm Rabbi Bob. I'm Bob Alper. I'm a rabbi comedian. And I have a book. I'd written my first book, and it has been published. So I had my publisher send him a copy. This is before, and I got to Detroit, and on Saturday's paper, there's a big article about my book, saying, and by the way, he'll be performing. There's an article about the book, which his name is David Crum. He called a volume of spiritual gems, and gave it a 4-star review, and that's kind of launched things. David went on to become a publisher. He published my second book. Read the Spirit Press is his company. He published my second book. He republished my first book. He's become a dear friend. But that's how it all started. But anyway, where was I? I went off on a tangent about the book. Oh, so the books are available through Barnes and Noble and through Amazon. Just put in my name and they'll come right up.
Okay.
I shouldn't say this, but I think you can also get them like used copies for $1. But you know what? I'd rather have people read.
With no cover.
Yeah, right.
No cover.
So they're available too. The next show is December 3rd. I'll be in Bennington, Vermont. Show for the synagogue there, and December 24th, I'll be in Sun City Center, Congregation Beth Israel in Florida near Tampa. December 25th in the afternoon in Bethel, Israel at Port St. Lucie, Florida. And December 25th, late afternoon at Beth Ami Congregation in Boca. And those 3 shows on December 24th, 25th, I think all of them are calling them Yule in the Shul.
I love it. That's great. Did you come up with that?
Years ago.
Yeah, that's amazing.
You've been listening to The Maggid Method, and I'm Daniel Steinberg. Learn more about the Maggid Method at maggidmethod.com, maggidmethod.com. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.